Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, the 26th of March, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start today's show off with a brief admin note. Session 2 of the Area Study Challenge is coming up tonight at 7 p.m. Central. You can join me for a free training session on Threat Analysis 101. We're going to be talking about how to identify threats and hazards that are specific to your area and how to begin a threat assessment, because it doesn't matter what happens in the future. War with Iran, war with China. By the way, this war with Iran stuff is starting to tick up. Uh, who knows what's going to happen? Great Depression 2.0, cyber attacks, all sorts of stuff. It doesn't matter what happens on the strategic level. We have to be prepared for the local impacts, the local effects. And so we're going to be focusing on that tonight, how to do an area threat assessment so that we know what to prepare for. One of the most common emails that I get is, Mike, what should I be preparing for? There's all this stuff happening. Do your area study, look at your area's threats and hazards. Let's start to look through some of the scenarios, realistically, the scenarios that you may be dealing with, whether that's a natural disaster, which is most likely, or potentially a man-made disaster. Let's write those down. And now you've got a list. Now you know exactly what to be preparing for, so you can register for that. It is free, by the way. It costs only your time. Head over to www.areaintelligence.com and sign up and join us. That's coming up tonight, 7 p.m. Central. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Good morning, Robert. Let's go ahead and start off. There's a number of very important developments that I want to cover today. One of these things has to do with what House Speaker Mike Johnson has said about these federal courts, especially the lower courts, that are issuing injunctions against the Trump administration. Apparently, Republicans may have a plan to maybe solve that problem, probably create some other problems, but what's the latest here?
Good morning, Mike. That's right. So yesterday, House Speaker Mike Johnson said that Congress has authority over these lower courts that are opposing the Trump administration, and also hinted that they are said explicitly that Congress is going to take action, and hinted that this could include cutting funds to lower courts or even eliminating entire district courts. And this was backed up by House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan, who's from Ohio, and he said everything is on the table, and they're talking about potentially passing legislation to cut these lower federal courts, which is under Congress's constitutional authority, or cutting funding and conducting oversight. And I think they also said they're going to talk to some of the appropriations official, like the lawmakers that are in charge of appropriations in the House, to start talking about curtailing funds to these courts if they don't stop issuing these nationwide injunctions.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, so we were talking before the show. What's the stat on how many foreign-born federal district court judges there are in one of those circuits?
So I saw that there are something like 1/3 of the judges in the Washington, D.C. district court were not born inside the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this could be a case where, I mean, is this realistic that Congress is going to pass? Is this just a House thing? Does this have to be confirmed by the Senate? They just cut the funding or even dissolve these federal courts? And I guess they do this instead of trying to impeach these judges.
Well, I think on the funding side, that's primarily at the House. They do have a lot more weight when you're talking appropriations. I think structurally, a lot of spending bills, whether it's to increase or decrease spending, are supposed to start at the House. Mm-hmm. So they probably have a bit more weight. Now, to get a bill to pass the Senate, they could do what's called the nuclear option and remove the Senate filibuster, what's called the legislative filibuster, by just passing the bill and basically saying that it is now law. That's how in previous administrations, Democrats, removed the filibuster on judicial appointments under the second Obama term, and then Republicans did the same for Supreme Court appointments during Trump's first term. Mm. And so while it does under normal procedures as they exist now, the Republicans would need at least 7 Senate Democrats across the aisle and vote for this, which is unlikely. They could take that nuclear option because all they require is a simple bill to restructure the federal courts.
That strikes me as unlikely. I don't want to belabor this point, but Robert, that strikes me as unlikely because there are going to be some Republican holdouts. In the Senate especially.
Yeah, I expect that they could get to 50 with J.D. Vance as the president of the Senate being the tie-breaking vote, but that would require that a what it would be a major political escalation of eliminating that filibuster.
It would. And this is we're getting into protest season now. Actually, there's a huge uptick over the past couple of weeks, huge uptick in protests. There's a major protest day coming up on April 5th as well. Another one of those national days of protest. Robert, it seems to me like we are getting into you mentioned this is an escalation. It seems to me like we may be getting into I don't know. I don't see Democrats going along with this. We'll leave it here for now. This would be a major escalation. So, Robert, please do stay on top of this. And I'll just tell you, I'll just go ahead and say, I think 2020 was an attempted popular revolution against the Trump administration. I've talked about this many times before, my reasoning. And one of my expectations is that a color revolution would again be on the table, or some form of popular revolution against the Trump administration, if they do try to fundamentally transform the courts, they're basically trying to fundamentally transform the government now. This is kind of like popular revolution watch kind of stuff. Just for me, tracking the left, just knowing how they're going to respond. This is probably the most concerning thing that I've seen so far, just in terms of the reaction that this will generate. Let's move on to the Trump administration. They're trying to centralize all these federal payments going through the Treasury. What's going on?
This is from an executive order issued yesterday by President Trump, and he's directing federal agencies to centralize their payments through the Treasury Department and the Office of Management and Budget. And he's ordering them to cooperate on what they're calling pre-certification verification for all of these payments. And he also directed these federal agencies to disclose payment records to the Treasury Department to identify and prevent or recoup fraudulent and improper payments. And I think this is another move by the Trump administration, among many since January 20th, to bring the federal Treasury, not the Treasury Department itself, but the control of the actual flow of money in the federal government under more direct control of the executive branch, by centralizing it under the Treasury Department, where he has his own appointee as Secretary of Treasury, and under OMB, where he has more direct control from the White House.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes sense. And then finally, yesterday there was a widely publicized hearing. It's the annual worldwide threats hearing. This was happening in the Senate yesterday, and we saw a number of Trump administration officials come out and talk about what they see as the top threats to the United States and U.S. national security. Let's go ahead and dive into that.
Yeah, there were a lot of the same things we've seen in these annual worldwide threat hearings, especially talking about foreign adversaries like China, Iran, and North Korea. But there were a few things that stuck out to me, and one of those was that the current Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said that Mexico's drug trade had become more fragmented due to low barriers of entry for fentanyl production, and that Mexico-based transnational criminal organizations are ramping up attacks on security forces. And the ODNI, the annual threat assessment that was also released yesterday, that had some of these points, it showed that according to U.S. government data, and that they've been able to get these reports together, that these cartels have conducted 1,600 lethal attacks against Mexican authorities in 2024 alone. And this was up from what they said were three reported attacks between 2020 and 2021. They also talk.
If I can just paying attention to Mexico news every so often, I would note that these are not only direct action attacks, so like ambushes of Mexican National Guard. These are also IEDs specifically targeting. There were some, disappearances and civilian murders are just rampant in a lot of places in Mexico. And what happened was one of the cartels called in to the Mexican National Guard. They said, "Hey, there's a bunch of bodies out here. There's a shallow grave. It's a mass grave. You need to come out here and look at this." And the Mexican National Guard troops, they get out there and their ID strung up all across this thing. And they were specifically targeting first responders. So some pretty heinous stuff. And so this is not just direct action attacks like ambushes. This is also IED attacks. I just throw that in there for some additional perspective, Robert.
Well, that was also a point made in the annual threat assessment, is that they were seeing a lot more IEDs in these lethal attacks. And then the annual threat assessment also pointed out that the Islamic State of Khorasan, or ISIS-K, is the most capable of these transnational Islamic threats of carrying out attacks abroad. And in the threat assessment, they pointed out that arrests of these ISIS-K supporters in Europe and the U.S. Highlight their intent and growing capability beyond South Asia, which I think ties into something that you've talked a lot about, is this, this from Sarah Adams, that former CIA targeter and analyst, talking about potential for ISIS-K attacks inside the United States.
Mhm. Yeah, and Sarah Adams, by the way, she doesn't just talk about the potential. She's predicting this is going to happen. There's going to be a 9/11 2.0 carried out in the United States by Islamic terrorists. She says, I believe she says that ISIS-K, or the Islamic State in the Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, is going to take credit for this. It may not be carried out exactly by ISIS-K, but they're going to take credit for it. And one thing she also said here, she just said this over on Twitter, that the relatively short section, I think it was like maybe 1 page or less, shows that the U.S. national security establishment is still not making ISIS-K a top priority, or still not making the Islamic threat inside the United States a top priority. That's just what she says. Robert, please continue.
Well, as a response to that, there was an announcement from the Trump administration yesterday, and they're ordering federal agencies to pause, or officials to pause green card application processes for immigrants who have asylum or refugee status. And I think the point of this is actually to, try to address this potential Islamic threat, this ISIS-K threat, because if I remember correctly, we covered this when it broke last year, right before the election. But there was an attempt, or there was a plan to conduct election day attacks in, I think it was Oklahoma, and the people involved with that came in under the Afghan refugee program and apparently had some kind of communications or connections with ISIS.
Great point.
And then the last comment that stuck out to me from this hearing was the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command Commander General Timothy Hall, and he said that he was given, this was in response to a lawmaker question about cyber attacks, and he said he was given clear guidance on restoring cyber deterrence from Defense Secretary Hegseth, and obviously said he would provide details during closed hearings. And I think this is a sign of a really good confirmation that the Trump administration is shifting to an offensive cyber strategy that we've talked about over the last few months, with the intent to deter foreign adversary cyber attacks and intrusions. But I think one major obstacle to this is the attribution problem for cyber attacks, because a lot of the actual cyber attacks that have targeted, like the major health insurance payment system last year, and some of these water purification facilities, and a lot of the ransomware stuff has come from criminal groups. But there is some kind of interrelation between those criminal groups and these foreign adversary actors who are buying data from these groups, or they could be conducting attacks that use the same TTPs as these groups, and it kind of confuses the issue of attribution and might be an obstacle for a more offensive cyber strategy.
Mm-hmm. This is the nature of hybrid warfare. Nation state level intelligence and cyber departments or units using criminal organizations to carry out their objectives, either wittingly or unwittingly, on behalf of these criminal organizations. All right, let's move on here to the next item. We'll start with our domestic roll-ups here. All right, so this is the Southwest water situation has been a recurring topic, pretty important topic for millions of Americans. And apparently the State Department has denied a Mexican request for greater access to water from the Colorado River.
Yes, and this is based on a 1944 water sharing treaty. So this, like you said, this fight has been going on for a very long time, and in the decade, measured in decades in the U.S., because the Colorado River Basin has has had a long time drought in a lot of areas, and so these states are still, even within the United States, fighting over water sharing rights from the Colorado River Basin. And Mexico has curtailed their side of this treaty by either postponing or not giving as much water as is outlined in the treaty. And now the State Department said that they're denying this request because Mexico has asked for a special delivery channel of water. And this is after, I think part of this is because Mexico City actually had a water crisis at the beginning of last year. That's one of the motivations, likely one of the motivations behind delaying these deliveries. But I also saw something interesting is that they're having issues with water treatment, and apparently 100 billion gallons of Mexican sewage and pollution has actually flowed from Mexico into California since 2018. So part of this issue is also they can't actually treat their water at least effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the big concerns that maybe would drive additional Mexican nationals into the United States in previous years. Just the really bad drought conditions in Mexico City, which is the big capital, one of the largest cities in the world. All right, let's move on to the USDA. This is concerning, Robert, because you say the Trump administration is figuring out that the Biden administration has been doing some hinky stuff with USDA. And now, since the administration is trying to cut the USDA budgets, they may be running into issues. What's going on?
So the USDA said yesterday that the Biden administration created what they called an unsustainable programming and expectation for these food purchases through the USDA using the Commodity Credit Corporation. And this was after state officials, I think it was 25 Democratic senators and some of these state officials and food banks warned that cuts to these food assistance programs would impact millions of Americans. And I think this is, like you said, very concerning, because if we do see some type of economic downturn or crisis while these food benefits are being cut, I think it's creating conditions for something like a repeat of 2020 or some type of domestic unrest that is much more massive than the 2016, 2017, more isolated, violent political events. And this is, I think, as the USDA pointed out, a side effect of the Biden administration ramping up these food assistance programs during his term. If I remember correctly, the number is something like they added up, they increased the budgets for these programs to something like $500 million, and they're trying to make cuts. And it's, unfortunately, I think for the Trump administration, the Biden administration has set this expectation for a massive amount of emergency food spending.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, let's keep an eye on that. That's also concerning, considering we're probably going through a period of economic and financial instability at some point this year. All right, let's move on to Pennsylvania, because this is only a state Senate seat, but Democrats flipped this seat in a district that previously went for Trump by something like 15 points. Robert, just take us through like the basic details here.
So Democrat James Malone, he's projected to defeat Republican Josh Parsons in this race, and it's for Pennsylvania State Senate District 36. And like you said, President Donald Trump won this district in the 2024 election with 57% of the vote. And this was at the margin on this was very low. Right now, it's projected to be fewer than 500 votes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted you to bring this up specifically because I've seen a lot of Democrat organizers and Democrat political action groups come out and say, we can do this. We can beat Trump. We just have to get out and vote. And there is a tendency, I think, by Republican voters to say, all right, we did it. Our guy's in. Trump's in the White House. Everything's cool. And then they don't show up to vote. And then Democrats end up flipping a bunch of seats. And so Democrats are treating this as a bellwether. Like, hey, we have a ton of grassroots support, and we can go right into the midterms in 26 and take back the House and Senate, which would be catastrophic to the Trump agenda. So I just bring this up to make that point. Let's also move on. Let's go through these here pretty quickly. Secretary of State Rubio is headed down to the Caribbean to meet with officials. What's going on?
I think it's actually
yep. I'll hop in here. That's actually down here in the global. So yes, he's heading to Jamaica to meet with several Caribbean officials, including the head of state of Haiti, to discuss Haiti's ongoing gang and security problem. They're going to try to figure out what can be done, and then first steps towards developing a strategy to fix it. He's also visiting Guyana tomorrow to discuss their border security issue, because Guyana currently has a maritime border security issue over oil reserves with Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So they'll be attempting to figure out what exactly America can do to help Guyana maintain those. Now, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is also making a Latin America trip. She's heading to El Salvador, Colombia, and Mexico. El Salvador, she's going to visit a prison that we are deporting criminals to. Colombia, she's actually trying to figure out, okay, well, how can the U.S. help mitigate Colombia's drug and Venezuelan migration problem, because that will basically cut off a large source of illegal migration at the source. And lastly, she's discussing border security with the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, on Friday. Now, moving over to Asia. So last week, Army announced that the U.S. Army announced that they would be sending another Typhoon missile battery over to somewhere in the Pacific, but they didn't specify where. The Philippine state media came out and said, yes, we're getting it. It's coming here. They're going to deploy it at some point soon. Now, this is a pretty significant issue because the first one that the Army deployed to the Philippines for Balikatan last year, they trained up the Philippines on and then just kind of left it. I think there probably still are a couple of U.S. Army guys there with it just for face, but it was never officially transferred, even though it was de facto transferred. And this missile system is compatible with the Tomahawk cruise missile, which even the older versions of the Tomahawk allow the Philippines to reach out and touch basically the entirety of southern China. So this is an enormous threat for the Chinese mainland. China has been raising a stink over it for the entire last year, including demanding that the Philippines remove it, and they have not. I actually have that map up here if you want it.
Yeah, let's post it. Jared, thanks for bringing this up, because we've previously talked about the U.S. Army has this pre-positioned stock program, and it was pretty relevant and widely discussed in Europe. There are caves in Norway, apparently, with tanks and all sorts of stuff. There's not been a similar program, I don't think, or at least not to the extent that we have seen in the Asia Pacific. But this looks like a case where the U.S. military is moving equipment over to the Indo-Pacific for these military exercises, and then instead of redeploying them back, they're just leaving them there in place, which is effectively a pre-positioned stock program.
I don't remember if it was 2023 or very early 24, but we covered the Marine Corps mentioning that they were doing a pre-positioning program over in Asia. So, and at that time I said, yeah, I kind of expect the rest of the branches, if they are doing this, they're just not going to talk about it, but the Marine Corps is definitely doing it now. And that does appear to be exactly what's happening. One thing with these Typhoon missile launchers is they're all truck mounted, so they can shoot and scoot, which is extremely difficult for China to potentially, fire back on.
All right.
Okay.
Let's move on. So there's an underwater unmanned sea vehicle produced by Taiwan. Just give me the bottom line, Jared.
Bottom line is they made this thing incredibly quick. I expect them to pump out a whole lot of them. This is part of Taiwan's asymmetric capability strategy, where they will essentially fight a guerrilla war against China in the Taiwan Strait using these. And these things are autonomous capable. So I expect these are actually going to hinder any amphibious assault to a great degree until China can figure out how to actually deal with these.
All right. And then finally, wrapping up here, the U.S. Defense Ministry came out and apparently said, hey, the Americans, they actually kind of have a point regarding Europe briefly.
Yep. The UK Defense Minister went on a little radio tour, and that's exactly what he said is, yes, Europe has not been pulling its weight. We need to pull our weight, and the UK is leading the charge on that, which is funny to hear, but at the same time, it does show that Europe is starting to take its security much more seriously.
Sure seems like reality is slapping them in the face. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to today's warning items, starting with the potential for a 2025 general strike. There was a town hall meeting last week, and I just recently got around to watching this video where Representative Jim McGovern, he's a Democrat from Massachusetts, he brings up the topic of using a nationwide general strike to end a constitutional crisis with the Trump administration. Now, general strike is where you get all the major trade unions, and most or all of them agree, yes, we're going to go on strike. And they push their workers out to picket lines or to protest or whatever. And this really is for political and economic effect. Previous attempts at general strikes have failed pretty spectacularly. I remember reporting on one, was it in 2020? They wanted to get 1 million signatures. There was they built this whole website trying to push this idea of a general strike. They wanted 1 million signatures. I think they got like 10 or 11,000 or something like that. So pretty nowhere close to where they need to be. And this is exactly what McGovern said. He said, quote, "We need to start thinking outside the box, or we need to start thinking about outside the box ideas like a general strike. It's easier said than done because it requires buy-in by everybody." He continues to say, quote, "A lot of people, they're not ready for it yet." And by the way, that was met with thunderous applause during this town hall. So going back to 2020, we have seen a number of failed general strikes. That on its face says a 2025 general strike is probably not going to happen. However, we have also Robert's talked about this many times, a potential for a general strike in 2028 because Sean Fain over at UAW, United Auto Workers, has been pushing all of these trade unions to negotiate their next contract expiration dates on April 31st, 2028, which would set up the beginning of strikes on May Day, International Workers' Day, the socialist holiday, for 2028, which is, again, an election year. Just reading through some of the commentary, I've noticed a number of these left-wing media outlets have glommed on to this idea. And the theory would go that if Trump does defy the courts, and we do have some legitimate constitutional crisis, that a national general strike would put political, social, and economic pressure on the Trump administration to obey these lower federal court judges who are issuing these injunctions. And they're proposing this as a resolution to push the Trump administration to back down from this impasse with these courts. And so effectively what they're saying is run a nationwide general strike until the Trump administration obeys these lower federal courts. So this is something I'm watching. I don't think this is likely, but with certain accelerators, especially the escalation with the courts, we could potentially get there. I don't think it's likely right now, but in another few months, who's to say that the social temperature won't be turned up substantially? All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item here. Robert, Moody's has been talking about this for a long time. They say, just like members of Congress have said, the U.S. fiscal trajectory is unsustainable. Moody's previously, during the major shutdown in 2011, and then I think again in whatever year it was where there was a big shutdown under the Trump administration, they actually reduced the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA+, and now they're coming back and saying Moody's, which is one of the big three credit rating agencies, is coming out and saying this does not look so good. So what are they saying?
This was a report that Moody's released yesterday, and in it, analysts say that the U.S. fiscal strength is in a multi-year decline, and they're saying that it is now deteriorating further. And they see that the rising pace of this deterioration is due to interest payments to revenue ratio that's increased from 9% in 2021 to 30%, or is projected to increase to 30% by 2035. And a lot of this is also federal deficit related. And they said they expect the deficit to increase from 8.5% of U.S. GDP or to 8.5% of U.S. GDP by 2035. And they say this is due to increased interest payments on debt and healthcare entitlement costs. And they also project the U.S. debt burden to be 130% of GDP by 2035, which in this report, they also point out that the other sovereign ratings that they give for some of the other largest economies outside the United States, their debt to GDP ratio is below 50% on average. So they're pointing out that there is a massive issue with deficit and debt spending, and I think part of this is because the Trump administration is talking about these tax cuts and the reconciliation bills, and there is a push from some Republicans in the Senate to do this without accounting for those tax cuts, without some kind of other spending cut.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed a number of these investment bank and financial analysts also saying this is set to greatly expand the budget deficit in a time where the Trump administration is purportedly trying to balance the budget by the end of Trump's term. More to come on that. Robert, you bring up something that I actually did not see, which is that Ray Dalio had a private meeting with congressional Republicans, warning them about what they call "quote unquote" unfunded tax cuts. What's going on?
Yeah, this was a meeting ahead of these negotiations between House and Senate Republicans, and Ray Dalio said to them that the U.S. is in what he called a precarious time in the big cycle due to these these unfunded tax cuts. And Ray Dalio, for him, the big cycle is he took a lot of historic data on the rise and fall of past empires, and he this chart that he provided in, I think, his latest book shows that according to the metrics that he measures, I think it's like 18 different metrics that he aggregates into one average number, that we are actually on the other side of a peak of the U.S. empire. And I think his concern, while the meeting was private, I think his concern is that some of these moves are that are going to expand deficit spending, and what Moody's has pointed out are putting the U.S. on a major negative trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this chart right here is actually from Ray Dalio's book, Principles for Navigating, I think, the Changing World Order. Yep, Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order, just to get the title correct. It's a fantastic book. I read it back in 22. Dalio talks about a pretty wide array of potential outcomes for the United States. He's pretty unabashed in his outlook for the United States, that we are past the peak. China's rise is ascending. The United States conditions are deteriorating, not only in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. And so this is why I think this matters a whole lot when Ray Dalio, by the way, Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, which for a long time, many years, was the world's largest hedge fund, also the world's most successful hedge fund. Ray Dalio is a guy that's made many billions of dollars by making big bets using other people's money. This is an industry, hedge fund industry. If you're not very good, you don't stay for very long. And so Ray Dalio's track record here is I think lends him a lot of credibility. It makes it very concerning to me when Ray Dalio says stuff like this. Ray Dalio is a xenophile. The guy loves China, which is he doesn't have both feet in the United States. I'll tell you that. Robert, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think his basic argument for the big, what he calls the big cycle, is that when you start to hit these peaks and declines, when you get on the other side of the peak, you're headed toward a revolutionary period. His argument is that the people with wealth at the time of the peak, as we get on the other side of that peak, there are other people, looking to change that. As he said, the people that aren't the wealthiest experience the impacts of this decline much more significantly than people with wealth. So it puts us in a dangerous political territory where there could be very increased revolutionary sentiment, that could, I think, in his argument would be, cause a lot of domestic unrest and potential for some type of political revolutionary movement.
Mm-hmm. Ray Dalio does mention this. I go around the state of Texas and I give talks to these county level Republican groups, and I show several charts from Ray Dalio. And one of the things that Ray Dalio talks about in this cycle, he goes back and does a multi-thousand year history of essentially world orders, or at those times, world orders, great powers, empires. And one of the things he says is that you get this period of prosperity, and then you get debt expansion. And what happens is, invariably, at least in the era of fiat money, going back to the Netherlands, United Kingdom, United States, you have a debt bust, because a central bank or whoever controls the money supply will expand the money supply during good times, and then they're forced to expand the money supply even more during bad times, and that ratchets up the debt. The debt is not paid down, and that leaves these countries on the hook to just print even more money in the future, because they have to pay down their debt. The only way you're going to do that is by monetizing the debt and inflating it away. And so what happens is, Ray Dalio says, all right, you get to this peak, the zenith of this world order or your empire, and you have a debt bust. And that begins the downhill slope. We have not yet had the debt bust, but according to Ray Dalio, that is the trigger where things really start to fall apart. And he says after that debt bust, you have credit expansion. You also have money printing. So according to Ray Dalio, the United States has not seen the worst of money printing, which has to be true because we've got to print trillions of dollars to pay down the debt eventually. And then you get into two things: debt restructuring and political restructuring. Debt restructuring means moving the financial chairs to extend the fiscal life of your world order. Political restructuring means new governments, means collapsing. We're talking about state breakdown here and the formation of new governments. And, again, this is not some conspiracy theorist, tinfoil hat YouTuber. This is Ray Dalio, who founded and ran for decades the world's largest and most successful hedge fund. So I put a lot of credence into this, and this is very concerning. Robert, thanks for bearing with me. Let's go ahead and move on here to these executive orders to secure elections. Now, Robert, when I say that in the coming months, we could see the political, social, and economic temperature turn up, we could actually start seeing accelerators of low intensity conflict. This is one of those things that seems to me, if not a trigger, at least an accelerator of nationwide protests, maybe that general strike we're talking about, maybe political violence. What is in this latest Trump executive order?
So this order directs the Election Assistance Commission and some of the other cabinet agencies, including Justice, Treasury, and Homeland Security, to enforce federal election laws. And specifically, they're going to require documentary proof of citizenship on national mail-in voter forms from the Election Assistance Commission. And they're also threatening to cut off funds to states through these federal agencies if they don't comply with these requirements. The one other thing that stuck out is that Trump wants the Election Assistance Commission to recertify voting systems that the states use using a new standard that is going to require a voter verifiable paper record. And they're also he's also directed the DOJ to take all necessary actions to enforce a uniform federal election day. So that would curtail a lot of these, what we saw after 2024, where there are weeks where ballots are still being counted in some states for, in some races. And I think there are two things here, two problems with the perception of election integrity, because I think the Trump administration has identified the motivators or the catalyst for a lot of the Republican voter and some independent voters' perception of a loss of legitimacy in American elections that we've talked about, I think, in polling showing immediately post-2020 election. But on the other hand, some of these moves, like the recertifying the election, the voting machines, I think has the potential for the Trump resistance 2.0 to argue that this recertification is the Trump administration's attempt to meddle with the back end of this election infrastructure, and then in this case cause Democratic voters to question the legitimacy of future elections.
I have not yet seen the left-wing reaction, but I'm sure it will be swift. I'm sure there's going to be talk about nationwide protests, and you have to get into the street. It's a little bit, actually a lot of bit concerning to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, because there is this idea that protests do not work. And actually, we can go back and look. There's been studies on this that say protests actually don't work. It has absolutely zero, essentially negligible impact on administration decisions. Protests do. And so what's the next logical conclusion? If protests don't work, you have to pursue more direct forms of activism, potentially militancy. To me, I don't think that we will repeat 2020 this year, but if we do, it's probably going to be over this Trump executive order and what the left perceives the Trump administration trying to do by exerting federal control over these elections. This to me seems like a potential trigger incident, even though there's not a lot of accelerators of conflict right now. This is at least going to be an accelerator and possibly a trigger.
I agree. And I think this was a point that we made during the pro-Palestine movements, waning after the initial weeks of protests, is that there is a strong sentiment amongst a lot of these activists that they need to move to direct action. And we saw, I think during Stop Cop City, there was an uptick in a lot of these direct actions, like arsons against police vehicles, construction vehicles. And now we're seeing something similar with the Tesla takedown stuff. there's the protests at the Tesla dealerships and all that, but at the same time, there are a lot of targeted attacks against these dealerships, targeting the charging stations. And I think what's dangerous about that is that it's not just organized radical, far left groups doing this, which some are based on some of the TTPs, I think, but also a lot more individuals are becoming politically activated and self-radicalizing and taking direct action on their own without any kind of central organization, which I think is actually a dangerous indicator of just the ramping up of this political temperature in the United States.
Yes. All right. So I think we're not officially on Riot Watch, but we are on Riot Watch essentially here, Robert. From my perspective, I think this is going to be massive. As a matter of fact, I think we'll start seeing blowback immediately. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's move on to just a couple of things. Jared, very briefly, there were these talks in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia between the United States and Russia. Just give me the bottom line.
Bottom line is Russia demanded, before peace and ceasefires were even agreed to, opening of the Black Sea and renewed access to the international payment system, which shows to me that the Russians are finding it exceedingly difficult to operate outside of the system. So I think that
Russia wants access to SWIFT, which is the U.S. financial transaction clearinghouse. Okay, I think that's a very reasonable conclusion that Russia does want access to dollars again, because BRICS has talked about this for 2+ years now, 3-ish years, and they've not made a lot of headway on getting off the dollar. The only thing they've been able to do is engineer these fairly low-level bilateral currency trades where they swap each other's currency. It's not a replacement for the dollar system, because credit markets aren't that large for the non-dollar system. China doesn't have it. China can't replace the credit markets that the U.S. dollar has. Any other point on this, Jared?
Nope.
Okay, great. And then let's finish up here with Venezuelan oil tariffs. What's going on?
Yes, so the Venezuelan oil tariffs are going to apply to anybody that buys Venezuelan oil directly or indirectly, and that accounts for, this will apply to countries even if it is a private company making the purchase. So any private Chinese company that buys oil, China's getting hit with it. And the administration made it a point to say that it will also apply to any Hong Kong or Macau-based company that buys it. Those will apply to China, not just to Hong Kong and Macau. So this is a kind of a two-pronged approach here. What this is doing is specifically targeting TCOs like Trinidad and the Venezuelan administration. But also, this is going to... We talked about the concept of blanket tariffing everybody and then leaving China's after negotiations are done. What this does is raise the floor of tariffs on China ahead of time so that those remain elevated compared to everybody else.
All right. Can you feel it, folks? I feel, I start my morning, every morning, reading through this left-wing media. And Jared, this has nothing to do with tariffs on Venezuelan oil. However, just looking at even today, for members, we run this riot and protest tracker every day. If you want to get access to that and see what riots or what protests right now are coming up in your city or in your area, head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Go ahead and join us. We publish this riot and protest tracker, and I have noticed that the number of protests every day are growing. These are still what I would call in many cases parochial, which means it's they're limited. This is not yet like some national level, nationwide mass mobilization protest. We have not seen that yet, but they are spread out all across the country, and these events have been increasing, and we've expected this for a while. As the weather warms up, we get into protests and potentially riot season. We'll see this. So I'll tell you, I think finally now we can go ahead and say it. We talked about having Riot Watch. I think we're getting pretty close to protests. Mass mobilization like fill the streets. They're trying to do a 1,000,000-man march in DC on April 5th. I'm not sure they'll get there, but it will probably be larger than the last protest, which is just another notch on this high water mark for the protest movement. All right, Jared, thanks for sticking around. We do have, if you can, please go ahead and tee up some of these questions. We'll just go ahead and do the full an hour long show today because we do have some questions. And Ben asks to kick us off here. The federal court's overreach appears outrageous by design and clearly politicized. Is this judicial overreach designed to go Trump into impeach, ignore the courts so they can have the issue? Robert, very briefly, you've previously said this is probably the strategy. You just have this buckshot. Every activist judge file some injunction or issue an injunction based on these courts and essentially dare Trump to defy it. Is this what's going on?
I think so. I think that's the strategy here. And that's, they have something like 100+ lawsuits now. So it increases their chances of being able to manufacture this constitutional crisis.
Mm-hmm. We have seen some threats from judges. One judge said there will be consequences for the Trump administration. We'll see. How many divisions does the courts have, as someone asked? Military divisions, essentially. All right. What's your assessment of Sarah Adams' credibility? I think she's credible. I can't talk about her sources because I don't know what they are, other than apparently they have sources in Afghanistan who have access to these terror training camps. Just from my, I've listened to 8+ hours or 12 hours, something like that, of Sarah Adams on the Sean Ryan show. And she is extremely knowledgeable. She very well may be the world's foremost expert, at least the English-speaking American world's foremost expert on this. So I take her seriously. I can't say whether this ISIS-K threat against a hospital in a mid-tier city, I can't say whether that's credible or not, other than I think Sarah Adams is credible. I think this intel firm out of Pakistan, which I talked about last week, I think they're probably credible. And I think people should take this seriously. A 9/11 2.0, maybe it seems grandiose, and I guess in many ways it is because we're so far removed from some kind of catastrophic Islamic terror attack. But Al-Qaeda still exists. All these Islamic groups still exist. It's not like they've gotten over it. It's not like they say, well, the war in Iraq was so long ago. The war in Afghanistan was so long ago. Let's let bygones be bygones. We know their objective is still to attack the United States, probably in a catastrophic manner. So I do take this threat seriously. And from the sounds of it, I've gotten a lot of text messages from people saying, hey, I work at a hospital and we just received a briefing, or, hey, I work in law enforcement. We just had a meeting on this the other day. So apparently this is making its rounds. By the way, this intel firm out of Pakistan says this attack is going to happen by the first week in April or something like that. And Eid is also coming up here. Eid's coming up this weekend, Sunday to Monday, or maybe it's Saturday to Sunday, but it is coming up. So I guess we'll see, but I do think it's serious. All right. It appears the Biden bureaucracy asked for food program budget increases to fund the illegal invasion. Robert, won't the deportations reduce the need for the large amount of funds? Briefly.
It could, but I think it could be argued that this is a deliberate political strategy to increase these entitlements during a period of time that Democrats can do it, and force Republicans to cut them to try to balance the budget, which in turn creates a lot of unrest over these entitlement cuts that then lead to Democrats getting an advantage electorally, which I think is probably at the center of this. Is the Biden administration increase these entitlements on the idea that Republicans would come in to cut them and that would make them unpopular.
All right. Great point. Thanks for that, Robert. Jared, next question to you. We've seen a fair amount of news publicizing these bombers being deployed to Diego Garcia, which is in the Indian Ocean. Does that represent a major shift in the stance towards areas of Yemen and Iran? It seems to me we're going to go back to the bomb buffet. Yemen's going to be eating at the bomb buffet again here pretty shortly with these strategic bombers. This does not appear relatively normal. This does appear as a message. What's your take?
I'd be careful about saying that it'd be out of Diego Garcia. That's pretty far. I think probably the more likely way to understand this is that there are a series of multilateral exercises prior to Bali Katan, and we're going to need these same assets over there for that. So they may be on their way to there. But if you leave it strategic, if you leave it ambiguous on what they're even doing over there, yes, you could send the message without having to actually take any direct action out of the Diego Garcia.
Okay. All right. Jared, great point. Let's move on. We're going to fly through these questions. Since many of the union members supported Trump against the leadership, what percentage might participate? Yeah, was it Sean O'Brien? Robert, remind me. Is Sean O'Brien? He's the Teamsters union boss. Yeah, the Teamsters did not. The national level Teamsters did not actually endorse a candidate. Did not endorse a Democrat for the first time in decades or generations or something like that. So yeah, listen. When they talk about a general strike, I think it's a really hard sell because you do have a lot of line worker union members who are pro-Trump who are not going to go along with this general strike. Robert, do you have any further thoughts?
Yeah, and this is coming from UAW, Sean Fain, and I think it's important to point out that the UAW is not just auto workers anymore. In order to build up their due-paying membership, they've incorporated a lot of like barista unions, like Starbucks unions, and I think in California, they were at the center of that grad student teaching assistant union push. So a lot of these unions that are, I think, more likely to participate in general strike are going to be the unions that have sucked up a lot of these more liberal shops, basically, and people like the Teamsters, where, yeah, the membership basically voted to endorse Trump. And for, I think, clearly political reasons, Sean O'Brien declined to endorse anyone. I think that's going to be a much harder sell for some of those more traditional labor unions.
Great point. Do you know whether this Moody's fiscal forecast included Trump's plan to balance the budget? I haven't seen it. It's hard for me to believe that Moody's would project anything on a balanced budget because I think it's just unrealistic. Frankly, I think it's unrealistic, but what say you?
So they did include basically they said that even if there were significant government spending cuts now under the Trump administration, it would only stabilize the U.S.'s fiscal strength at where it was post 2023 when they said that the U.S. was on a negative trajectory with a negative sovereign credit outlook. And I think there's an underlying assumption here that there are political obstacles to some of that spending cuts because we're talking like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And that's going to be too great to overcome for the Trump administration. And that's where a lot of money is put out.
Mm-hmm. Sure seems to be. Ben also asks if this is from Dalio's book. It seems the current plans for resolving spending issues would not be included. Yeah, that Dalio book came out, I believe, in 2022. So this is pre-Trump 2.0. What would the debt restructuring mean for student loans, Robert? Any idea?
I think he means department restructuring, and it's talking about the Department of Education.
Oh, okay.
I've seen that the proposal right now is to move student loan servicing to the Small Business Administration, but they're tied up in a lawsuit right now over this whole move with the Department of Education. So I think it still remains to be seen how that's going to actually work out.
All right. Seems like Russia's renewed access to SWIFT would be strategically beneficial to the U.S., loosens Russia's ties to China. Jared, I think this is the unspoken assumption here. But yes, this granting Russian access back to SWIFT, removing sanctions from the banks. I don't know what they're going to do with Russia's mirror payment system, but a big thing, I remember former Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo back in 23 went to Turkey to threaten Turkish banks to sever all ties with the Russian mirror payment system. This is probably another reason why Russia wants access to the SWIFT. So this does seem to be like trying to not necessarily curry favor, but rebuild ties with Russia.
Yep, I would
some sort of financial ties as leverage against China.
I definitely agree with that, and I think the main thing there is weaken Russia's resolve to step in China's favor in the Pacific if they need to, because what that would do is free up all of Japan's forces and remove the Vladivostok threat. It could potentially even remove economic support to China during during a war like that. Now, one lesson learned, I think maybe shared between Russia and China is that it is much harder to operate outside of the SWIFT system than was previously assumed. So that may actually be a greater deterrent to China than most other things that have taken place.
All right. Good point, Jared. All right, last question of the day. With the advent of increased riots, well, listen, potentially increased riots. One riot would be increased riots from here. The destruction of the funding for USAID, do you expect them to continue to increase or just become smaller and more violent? Well, late last year, after I made the conclusion that we would not see riots after a Trump win in November or in January 25, the course of action that I put the most credence behind was smaller but more violent, where you have a less sense of urgency. You have smaller groups because a lot of these far left networks have atrophied. The affinity groups have become smaller. There's just not the same level of participation and action, both in volume and in size and scope that we saw from 2015 all the way to 2021. And so being smaller, the key assumption then was, well, you're still going to have these hardcore adherents saying effectively protests don't work. Direct action will work. That is the only way you can, quote unquote, defeat fascism. Violence is the only language that fascists speak. This is effectively what they're saying. And so fascism has to be met with violence. And so I think that was my key assumption. I think probably my most likely course of action heading into this year. With funding cut for USAID, I think that is going to impact far left groups at some level. I think a lot of this stuff is like trickle down, meaning that these left-wing groups aren't getting millions of dollars in funding. I don't think they were ever doing that. I mean, people talked about, there's some left-wing financier, there's USAID money funding these Molotov attacks against these Tesla dealerships. Guys, these leftists will do that for free. You can go out and create a Molotov cocktail for less than $20. People do this for free. And actually, I'm trying to track down the court documents and the indictments against this guy. His name is Adam Lansky, I believe. And he was one of the guys back in January who threw a Molotov cocktail at a Tesla dealership and caused some Teslas to explode. Later, I think in February, he was the same guy that as he drove past the Tesla dealership, he was shooting a firearm at these Tesla vehicles. He was arrested, indicted earlier this month. And one of the things I'm interested in looking at is what actually comes out in the evidence. If there are ties, like he got money, I don't think he did. I don't think these are paid actors. I think they'll just do this stuff for free because they just do stuff. There's no profit motive among revolutionaries. So bottom line here is, do I expect these riots to increase? I think if there's a trigger event like widespread perception that Trump is trying to cook the next election by interfering in the election process, I think protests are definitely likely. Mass mobilization protests become far more likely. I'm not sure that we will get to a trigger event for riots yet, but I think that's where we are. So I hope that answers your question. And I'll also work on this. As I look at the backlash and look at the left-wing social media and what these leftist outlets are saying, I'll have a lot better picture of how they will respond. But that's my general take so far. All right, with that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. That's going to do it for today's extra long early morning briefing. We appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching. We'll be in your inbox tomorrow morning back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.